All right. Welcome, Ramsey. I hope you're doing well. I recently was reading about how you were talking to Aaron Brockett, if I'm not mistaken, the mayor of Boulder, about decriminalization of psychedelics in Boulder. There was this beautiful quote that you, I guess, posted on your story that is, we are going to liberate our medicines. And that kind of inspired me to ask you these questions. What is the process? What is going on with the decriminalization? How does that work? Specifically, I mean, you don't have to talk about specifically Boulder, but also in general.
hmm Great. Yeah, awesome. Great question. Um, so yeah, we're at a really interesting point in the trajectory of psychedelic policy reform. As many of us know, we have the psychedelic renaissance happening. And, within that renaissance, it spans so many domains of culture. It's particularly afflicting the, scientific domain. The scientific research is coming out as having its own renaissance. There is a huge renaissance in the psychedelic arts. If you look at all the visionary artists, all the painters, all the musicians in particular, there's some great psychedelic music coming out. It spans, the spiritual community, the therapy community, the indigenous community. So the psychedelic renaissance is huge. It's something that is important to so many people in our culture. It's not something that is like super specific to, one niche group or, some insular group of hippies or esoteric group. No, this is a renaissance that is, cross-domain and afflicts so much of our society, which is why when we look at, how we approach psychedelic policy reform, we have to be really careful about how we approach it. And we have to usher in, new policy that is careful to be equitable for all people. And that being said, there are a few, approaches that some people might want to take in regards to how to facilitate policy reform. One of them is what I would call the clinical approach. So there are clinical trials going on, testing different psychedelic substances like psilocybin and LSD for, different ailments, like depression, treatment-resistant depression, Alzheimer's. The list goes on. And there is a lot of promising research coming out. MDMA as well, MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, is doing a lot of research with MDMA in treating PTSD, and the results have been super, super promising. And likewise with psilocybin, the clinical trials for depression have been super, super promising. So there is one modality where the science community, the medical community is trying to usher in psychedelics back into polite discourse and bringing it in through what I would call the standard medical infrastructure, with the FDA, granting FDA approval and stuff like that. And there is another approach to psychedelic policy reform, which does not seek to confine psychedelics within the medical system, and that would just be flat out decriminalization. And when we talk about decriminalization versus legalization or regulation, these are important conversations because different people in our society are going to fall into different comfort zones of engaging with the substances. There is a very large and abundant legacy community who have been using psychedelics for generations, decades, centuries, even millennia. The legacy community has a deep history of using psychedelics and formulating their own protocols and formulating their own containers and systems of use and engagement. And there is a lot of collective wisdom. There's a lot of collective knowledge and learning that has accrued over the years. And there are people who have, found ways of being comfortable using these substances within that legacy system that has kind of organically coalesced on its own right over the years. For example, people who want to take psychedelics on, like, let's say, in a ceremonial setting with, some other people, where there might be a shamanistic practitioner, or somebody who, has some sort of lineage. It could be an indigenous lineage. It could be a lineage that has come about from years of practice with the substance. Another example is somebody who just wants to trip alone, in their backyard or in a park. Another example is somebody who wants to microdose. So there are different ways of consuming psychedelics that are, derived from just the grassroots legacy collective knowledge in our cultural sphere over, the past, eon. And then the other mode of engaging with psychedelics, I would say, is, this is more so of what I would call the Michael Pollan, like the approach that the Michael Pollan crowd, tends to favor, or at least, from what I've heard, is this, I'll call it the regimented, safe container approach, which is, psychedelics consumed in a medically supervised setting, or maybe perhaps not even medically supervised, but a setting with a trained therapist or facilitator in a safe setting that has the guidance and the authority of the regulatory agencies. So, for example, there are lots of people in our society who could definitely benefit from having psychedelic experiences. For example, people who have been living with deep trauma for years, people who might have a terminal illness, people who just have trouble with their interpersonal relationships, and perhaps come from cultural backgrounds where the level of comfort that they might have with having psychedelic experiences with, some random person who calls himself a shaman in someone's basement is not going to jive with them. Or having a psychedelic experience by themselves without a guide is also something that doesn't sit with them. So there's a large amount of people in the population who would genuinely benefit from having a psychedelic experience, and would only feel comfortable doing that experience under a really safe container with, professional supervision and guidance. So you have these sort of different ways that people might engage with psychedelics, and we have to be careful about how we, move about with bringing in policy reform. I think it might be safe to say that there is a huge effort put into marketing psychedelics to the mainstream, using the language of these substances have to be done in safe containers under professional supervision. And, that sort of marketing helps to appeal to, that sort of marketing helps to appeal to the crowd who, perhaps they were never involved in the counterculture. Perhaps they were, completely averse to the hippie movement. Perhaps, they have, perhaps stigmas attached to psychedelics, or just maybe they just don't know. Perhaps it's fear of the unknown, or they have never really ventured out of their, slice of conscious experience. And that sort of marketing to those people is super useful, because it kind of, makes these experiences palatable to people who otherwise would, not be open to these experiences. But that all being said, that was kind of just like a long introduction to set the stage for, what the crux of my point is. That all being said, we have to be careful about not letting that very specific mode of engaging with psychedelics, which is, in that controlled, professionally supervised setting, we ought not to let that be the only legal and sanctioned way of engaging with psychedelics. And with that in mind, that's why decriminalization is a really important first step that, kind of like levels the playing field and creates a base for further elaboration and development of, like, let's call it psychedelic infrastructure to emerge. And when we get super eager about seeing all the policy reform coming out about psychedelics, especially with, Measure 109 in Oregon, which legalized psilocybin. And we have, in Colorado, we have two competing ballot initiatives that are vying to get on the ballot. One of them is Initiative 58. The other one is Initiative 61. Initiative 58 follows the tracks of Oregon and creates a regulatory framework for psychedelic experiences. And when we start talking about this newly emerging psychedelic infrastructure with all the policy reform and with new companies coming out that are going to be engaging with psychedelics, these new companies might have a multitude of different ways of providing psychedelic services. For example, some of these companies might be companies that own licensed healing centers, just like the buildings, the locations where people can come in and have psychedelic experiences. Another company, for example, might be one that connects people to trained sitters. Another company might be one that provides or manufactures the substance that would be under the standards of the regulatory agencies. Another company might be a company that tests the substances. So as you can see, there is a whole barrage of different companies that might be able to come in and fill the vacuum. And there is a huge vacuum and an opportunity for lots of economic growth and lots of economic opportunity. And I feel like a lot of venture capitalists, a lot of people with deep pockets have noticed that there is a huge financial opportunity to be made. And this is where the conundrum steps into play, because we have seen that some of the psychedelic companies that have been early on the scene have already indicated a penchant for what I would call anti-competitive behavior, where once you start mixing psychedelics with capitalism, corporations are going to do what corporations do, which is, try and maximize their bottom line, try and stomp out competition, try and monopolize. And, I will name drop, Compass Pathways has already received notoriety for, their attempt to patent the process of synthesizing psilocybin, as well as patenting trying to patent components of the therapeutic experience, such as holding someone's hand while they're having an experience, or you having a room that doesn't look like a medical setting and uses muted colors and has art on the walls, and all these things that might be part of a licensed way of having a psilocybin experience. These companies are trying to patent and do a land grab, and this raises really important issues, because I had framed this conversation, talking about decriminalization and then legalization and regulation. And those terms might be a little muddied. I could clarify them more intently later on. But for the most part, that is kind of like the dichotomy, is decriminalization versus regulation. And my belief is that they can coexist, but the syntax is important. The syntax is super important, because if we're going to usher in, policy reform, people should have the ability to engage with psychedelics however way they want to. If a person wants to have an experience by themselves in their backyard or at a park, they should have that right. If a person wants to microdose, they should have that right. If a person wants to sit in ceremony with a group of friends, they should have that right. If a person wants to have a psychedelic experience under a medically supervised, regulated setting with a trained guide, they should also have that right. And companies should have the right to offer those services. What we don't want to see is for the psychedelic companies that are going to be involved in what I'll call the medical industrial complex to come in first and then try and use their newly found financial leverage. Because if they jump in this game, they're gonna have a lot of money. They open these healing centers, they start providing legal psilocybin, they're gonna have a lot of money. And what we don't want to see is for these companies who have all of this new financial leverage to use that money to hire lobbyists who are going to go to, the government and try and, use talking points such as, oh, these substances are very unpredictable, they're destabilizing, they're unsafe, we're doing it the safe way, they're doing it the dangerous way. And, basically use some of the same old tired fear-mongering talking points to kind of prevent further access to open up for people to have access to these substances on their own terms. Because what these companies, if they are shooting for maximum profit, then the best thing they can do is try to stomp out competition. So to try and funnel the demand, so they would have to go through their company and have to go through their regulated process and stuff like that. So you can kind of see, where the landscape of, psychedelic reform lies in conjunction with, capitalism in the U.S., and how there is a well-worn precedent, especially with how cannabis reform played out, and how, a few big companies came in with big money came in and consolidated the market, dominated the landscape, and outcompeted, the small scale legacy growers. We don't want to see the same thing happen with psychedelics. We don't want to see, the big corporations with their big money come in and try and restrict access just so people have to, go through their, regulatory frameworks. And we've seen in Oregon with Measure 109, for someone to have a legal psilocybin experience, you have to have 3 mandatory sessions with your trained guide. And each session, costs about $1,000. So for the whole thing, it's about $3,000 to have a legal psilocybin experience in Oregon. And where Oregon really screwed up is in their bill that legalized psilocybin, they didn't include any carve out for personal use or microdosing. So technically, yes, Oregon last year in November voted to legalize psilocybin. It was the very first state to explicitly legalize psilocybin. It was, you could call it a huge milestone, but in many ways it was actually a huge mistake, because they only allowed psilocybin to be used in that highly regulated setting that is really cost prohibitive. It costs thousands of dollars to have a legal psilocybin experience. And the people that were put on the board who were setting the rules for, how this was going to be regulated in Oregon, they all have huge conflict of interest. Actually, one of the heads of the board in Oregon had to resign because I think they were involved in like 3 separate psychedelic companies that had vested interest in the new industry. And a lot of the language that we're seeing organizations like New Approach PAC pushing, they don't include carve-outs, or they don't include provisions preventing conflict of interest. And this is kind of where the contemporary state of psychedelic reform lies. Is we're witnessing this sort of corporate interest, enter the space and try and usher in the policy reform in a way that appeals to the masses, such that, okay, well, here you can have these experiences in a regulated, safe container. But if they do so without doing a complete decriminalization first, that only sets the stage for companies to come in and monopolize and try and box out competition, and and to keep the people who have been doing it underground or doing it on their own terms. Basically they're going to have to stay underground. And part of my job, part of my deep interest in this whole movement is to do my best to make sure that those who have been doing this in the dark can come in the light, and that there's enough room for everyone, and to not let corporations come in and monopolize the space and impose undue regulations that are just gonna stomp out the legacy communities in favor of big money and big corporations. And wow, that was a really, really long-winded answer to the question, but I think I got out most of what I wanted to say. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Of course, you touched on a lot of topics. I'm kind of proud of the second psychedelic renaissance, really. I was talking to this philosopher called Dr. Peter Sachs-Hu, and he told me about how there was supposed to be an outside project back in 1950s, which was essentially Aldous Huxley and some of his related philosophers. They wanted to get at least 100 intellectuals all around the globe back in 1950s to try mescaline and report back as to what were their intellectual thoughts and everything. Unfortunately, it never happened. But I keep wondering, if that had happened, maybe we wouldn't have a second psychedelic renaissance. Maybe everything would have been much more better when it comes to criminalization, decriminalization, etc. And like I was also looking into maps, and I mean, everyone does, because of their, brilliant work with MDMA, LSD, psilocybin. Also, I think now they're doing something with DMT, I'm not sure. And I personally wrote a paper about MDMA and PTSD because I'm studying in Tel Aviv University in Israel. Now I've graduated, but in Israel, it's compulsory for people of the age of 18, 19, 20 to put some of their time in army. And so they have this PTSD that they develop out of it. And so they have been researching and been administering, MDMA in low doses to see whether it helps their PTSD. And it has been, like, some of the research that has been coming from, Israel particularly has pointed to that. Also, like when you were talking about psychedelics, infusion with capitalism. So I think there's two elements to what capitalism is doing. One, which is, of course, it is good that we are kind of moving towards decriminalization faster because of the capitalistic agenda. But then at the same time, you mentioned patenting, right? That is also happening, which is the downside of it, because there's so many indigenous communities that tend to use these things as medicines. And now if you make these medicines and in a particular compound, whatever, and now they are, patented, it would mean that you're stealing, first of all, their culture, their ceremonies, their essence. And it's tragic to think about it. But then there's upsides and then there's downsides. So the question always becomes whether we're happy that California or any other state is producing like capitalistic psilocybin candies and etc. They're making all sorts of cannabis induced LSD, not LSD but psilocybin induced products. And it's good in the sense that it is facilitating the research forward, but and also the decriminalization. But as you said, the patenting, which brings me kind of back to the history of psychedelics. Like, so history of psychedelics, right? Like, I have been reading a lot of books about the history of psychedelics. One is The Immortality Key, and the other I've been told by Dr. Peter Sissis too is a really good, I would call him a psychedelic philosopher of our times, just like Humphrey Osmond back in the day. And so he told me about how in the Eleusinian Mysteries, and this is way, way back, this is not right now, they had this potion called Kaikon. And this Kaikon was ergot-based potion. And it is hypothesized that Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and all of these people were engaged in these Eleusinian mysteries and taking all of these substances to enhance their cognition or whatever at that time was, the use of psychedelics. And it's interesting because we are seeing that psychedelics is not a thing that we just made now. It's something that has always existed. There's in the Rig Veda, there's Soma, the mention of Soma. And there's a lot of debates, here in India, abroad, a lot of researchers have their own perspective about, what this substance is, what is this? And I think at the same time, like that we're researching about these compounds from a historical perspective, we know that these substances have been here for a long time. And it is only weird, not even weird, but it is absurd to be able to, forget that history and criminalize everything. And I think that's where Nixon government comes into play, the war on drugs. Aldous Huxley back in 50s, he met this guy called Arthur Hefter, who was the only person who was able to synthesize mescaline sulfate, the pure mescaline sulfate. And he gave it to Aldous Huxley, and Aldous Huxley tried it. He later on wrote the brilliant book, The Doors of Perception, completely changed at that time the way English literature, but also the way psychedelics were viewed at that time. And then in 60s, unfortunately, we had the Nixon government. Some people blame Timothy Leary, but maybe you and I can debate about this. Did Timothy Leary did good, or was it all bad?
I
That's
would love to have that conversation.
yeah, because here, like for me, I feel like he did a great job. So there's this thing, there's populist and elitist kind of approach to it. So populist is what Timothy Leary did, which is we're going to give psilocybin and LSD, to everyone to make it popular. And that's where also he kind of was mistaken as well. But then, the elitist is what Huxley was talking about, which is to only give them to intellectuals at that time. And this populist versus elitist thing comes into play when we talk about specifically, what Timothy Leary was up to. So what do you think about Timothy Leary? Was it all good? Was it all bad? What was it?
Oh, wow. Yeah, so there's actually a lot of things that you touched on that I'd like to address. We could go in reverse order, starting with Timothy Leary. So I think Timothy Leary is a really, really interesting case to understand the power of psychedelics. For example, Timothy Leary used to say that LSD was as powerful as the discovery of LSD was as powerful as the discovery of splitting the atom, and the power that these substances hold is just super, super powerful. And the saga of Timothy Leary is super interesting because he's the story of a psychologist who was working at Harvard and went to Mexico and had his first mushroom experience. And I think the famous quote is that in those 6 hours of his mushroom experience, he learned more about the mind than in like 20 years of being a professional psychologist. And he subsequently devoted most of his professional career to studying these substances, which was totally right. I mean, if you're a psychologist and then you discover that there are these items that allow you to have some of the deepest insight into your own psyche, and have these really powerful, sublime, transmutative, transpersonal, unitive ego dissolution experiences, like, of course, if you're any like real psychologist is going to like encounter that and be like, all right, this has to be studied. And taking that, Timothy Leary went in and started studying prisoners. There's the Concord prison experiments where they would try to see if psilocybin would help with recidivism for prisoners. And then the rest of the departments at Harvard and other professors such as Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, started getting interested. And then they eventually did the Good Friday experiments, which are famous, where they brought in a few religious figures. I think there was a priest, an imam, a rabbi, a Buddhist priest, or whatever their clergy are called. And so they had these experiments in the chapel for the Good Friday experiments, and they found that it was such a huge number. I think it was like 9 out of 10 people who had been given psilocybin reported experiencing mystical experiences, which was super profound. And this kind of like helps speak to the whole notion of set and setting. Being in that chapel with the intention of trying to have like a divine experience. It brought fruit. Really huge number of the participants reported having mystical experiences. And a lot of this research in the early days from Harvard came out of Timothy Leary and his support of the research. But Timothy Leary started garnering the ire of Harvard because of how he was championing these substances in a way that wasn't quite with the cautious demeanor that most medical professionals or researchers kind of have to put on. There's a decorum that's expected that if you're doing research, you have to like be super skeptical. Like, to do science, the whole point is to falsify. The whole point is to do your studies without projecting on too many of your biases. But the way that Timothy Leary was approaching psychedelics, it was almost messianic. It was like, these substances are the key, and I'm going to ride the wave and promote these substances as the key that they are. And I think what really, the straw that broke the camel's back was when Harvard was getting word that Timothy Leary was having retreats, like with students, where he was giving students like LSD, and perhaps even tripping with his students, outside of, any sort of research protocols or any of that sort. And it was just deemed not appropriate behavior for a professional at Harvard. So I think they fired him. Well, from what I've been told by people who knew Timothy Leary, it's not that he was fired; it's just they didn't rehire him or something along the lines. But for all intents and purposes, he was fired. And then shortly thereafter, Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, left Harvard as well. And then what subsequently followed was the Millbrook saga. They had a mansion. I think one of the nephews of like a really rich Wall Street person, a banker or something, had a mansion in upstate New York, and they created a little commune at this mansion, where they had like a dozen or so people living in this mansion, where they would have extravagant psychedelic parties. And they kind of like tested the limits. And Ram Dass writes about it in the first chapter of Be Here Now, how they would, just stack upon the LSD over and over. They would just like, take 500 micrograms, and then a few hours later take more, then a few hours later take more. And they were just surfing the high. And it just kept going on and on. Yeah. So at the Millbrook mansion, lots of crazy stuff happened, and Ram Dass writes about it a lot. And part of me always wonders, what was it like to be in Millbrook, during that phase where Timothy Leary and Ram Dass and a bunch of other people, the Millbrook mansion had lots of guests. Allen Ginsberg visited. Just so many guests kind of like went into that mansion, where they created a psychedelic commune. And it's just one of those like neat little periods of history where, like, in that mansion, it was just like a portal, a little vortex into the psychedelic realms. But I think they ultimately had to leave the mansion because they started being harassed by the feds. The authorities, were started staking out and stalking the place. And they had somebody who like a federal agent or an officer or somebody was camped out in their car, just like harassing all the guests who were trying to show up. And they raided the place trying to find drugs. And they just got super harassed by the authorities, so they eventually had to leave Millbrook. But subsequently, so after Timothy Leary left Harvard, he became a huge champion for psychedelics. He would go around and travel from town to town, city to city, giving talks. He would go to college campuses and give lectures, and he would speak at large public gatherings and just advocate for the youth to question authority and to think for themselves, and to tune in, to turn on, tune in, and drop out. And all these slogans that came out from Timothy Leary, those came organically from him just preaching to the masses, preaching to the youth, to just undermine the mainstream authority and think for yourself and break out of the boxes. And this ultimately came to a point where the United States was engaging in a war in Vietnam, and there was a lot of civil rights action happening. There was a lot of sexual liberation, feminist liberation. There was a lot of anti-war sentiment. So the 60s were a very tumultuous time, where there were so many revolutionary movements, so many civil rights movements, so many, I would even say, when I said revolutionary movements, they weren't all just like, peace and olive branches. There was some revolutionary movements that were trying to overthrow the U.S. government. You had the Weathermen, you had the Black Panthers, you had all these things that were, coming out during this same span. And while this is happening, the United States is trying to wage a war in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. And then you throw the psychedelics on top of that, and then you have this huge movement of anti-war protesters and hippies that are kind of undermining the mainstream conservative norms of the establishment culture. And in many ways, it set the stage for a moral panic, but the moral panic didn't happen on its own. So what happened was Richard Nixon saw all the chaos that was happening in his country, that he was trying to wage this war, and there were all these protests and revolutionary movements and people trying to overthrow the government, and there was just so much happening. And what he ended up doing was he had an aide who told him, you know what, why don't you create a scapegoat? Why don't you focus in, find something that you can, home in on, and make that your primary focus. And so what Richard Nixon did was he focused on drugs. So he found that he could increase his likability in the polls if he came down hard on drugs and sold a story to the public that he was, coming down hard on drugs and saving society from, the moral degeneracy. And he picks Timothy Leary as a scapegoat because Timothy Leary was, the largest voice who was kind of like advocating for people to use drugs, and LSD in particular, and basically helping foment the hippie movement and the anti-war movement. So Richard Nixon, he put a target on Timothy Leary because Timothy Leary was kind of, the front man for the hippie movement in a way. He was the person who was who had the credentials. He was the Harvard professor, the disgraced Harvard professor who went rogue and started telling our youth to take drugs and drop out of society. And that was kind of the that was kind of the story, the framing that was given to Timothy Leary by Richard Nixon. And what commenced was a giant goose chase. What commenced was Timothy Leary ended up getting arrested and got put into prison in California. And then the Brotherhood of Eternal Love paid the Weathermen to help break him out of prison. And then when he broke out of prison, he escaped out of the country and spent some time in Algeria under the protection of the Black Panthers. It's a crazy saga of what happened when Timothy Leary escaped from prison. There's a really amazing book about this called The Most Dangerous Man in America. I highly recommend this book. Anybody who's listening, it's a page turner. It's one of those books that it's a decently sized book. It's not a short book, but I probably finished it like in a day or two because I could not put it down. It was just like one of those books that makes you realize that reality is stranger than fiction. But people like to kind of, look at the Timothy Leary saga and kind of like pin the blame on Timothy Leary and say, the psychedelic renaissance back in the 60s was going really well. You had all this research in psychiatry and all these, things coming out, supporting the power and the use and the suitability of psychedelics to treat conditions and whatnot. And as soon as the psychedelics escaped the laboratory, as soon as they escaped the clinic and into the society without any guardrails, that's when shit hit the fan. And that's when society, the government came down hard and just ruined it for everyone and just criminalized it all. And I understand where that point comes from. And they say Timothy Leary ruined it all. They say Timothy Leary is the one who kind of released the psychedelics into society without guardrails. He opened Pandora's box and just let it loose into society. And it's all his fault that psychedelics are now illegal. And we had that huge, just like squashable research all because of that. I don't think that's a fair criticism. I do not put the blame on Timothy Leary because Timothy Leary was a natural reaction to the degeneracy of the government. And I think that what happened in the 60s was a product of its time. What happened in the 60s, we saw so many movements kind of like emerge around the same time. As I mentioned, you had the civil rights movement for, African Americans dealing with segregation. You had the feminist movement. You had the free love movement. You had the anti-war movement. All these things came out of the 60s. It was kind of obvious that, with the increase of, who knows what factors fomented that? But, you know, coming out of the 50s into the 60s, there was just a huge awakening of consciousness. And perhaps, who knows, maybe psychedelics contributed to that general awakening of consciousness. We know for a fact that psychedelics contributed to the awakening of consciousness in so far regarding the hippies and the anti-war movement. I'm not sure how much it relates to the rest of the movements of the 60s, but we know that in the 60s, you know, things were, a lot of Americans were waking up. And we saw that Richard Nixon was trying to keep up the war in Vietnam. And then all these Americans were all of a sudden having empathy for people on the other side of the pond. Instead of, you know, feeling super eager to just go overseas and kill a bunch of people for no reason, you know, they started realizing, hey, what the hell are we doing in Vietnam? And the government kind of just was in a very precarious state. And the revolutionary fervor that was in the air was a huge threat to the government. And that revolutionary fervor was directly the product of just how degenerate and fucked up the United States government was at the time, with, you know, all the civil rights issues and the war, and Richard Nixon's approach to governing. And so what Timothy Leary did was he basically did what he could to, you know, assist to the revolutionary fervor, because psychedelics were a huge boon, a huge discovery for the opening of consciousness, and just allowing people to tap into states of consciousness that that break out of what I would call the ossified conventions of, you know, our cultural norms. And it allowed people to see things in a new way. It allowed people to ponder, you know, to kind of like look at their situation in the third person bird's eye view, and realize what the hell is going on. And releasing psychedelics into the masses was it was a necessary thing. It was a necessary thing to, you know, if you have something so powerful, you know, are you just going to let you said it, are you going to let the elite control it, or are you going to release it to the population? And Timothy Leary was all about, you know, this is something that every human deserves to have the right to experience. This is something that every human ought to experience. And this was, of course, it defies, you know, the protocols of caution. It defies the protocols of like just like really careful vetting. And you know, it was, you know, I would say at least one criticism of Timothy Leary that is fair is that his just here's the LSD, release it to everyone, and do what you do with it. And sure, you could say that approach was, you know, kind of just a little reckless, but, you know, perhaps that recklessness was warranted. And you know, and it was ultimately the Nixon government that was freaking out over the destabilization of the social order, and feeling threatened at how their control over the population was being upended by all this increase in consciousness, and all this revolutionary fervor, and all this questioning of, you know, the war, and then our conservative social norms, and all these things that were kind of like upending the normalcy of the rule, the Richard administration, and their ability to contain and control the population. That is what caused them to cause the criminalization of these substances, because these substances, the psychedelics, were opening people's minds and undermining the government's control over the people. And then Richard Nixon and his allies subsequently decided to, hang on a second, my video. Let me just switch my camera. So Richard Nixon and his allies then decided that their way of addressing this is to just put the foot down on drugs and scapegoat people's drugs. And they even there's a conversation where Richard Nixon and one of his aides admitted that the reason why they did the war on drugs was to target certain populations. You know, they criminalized heroin and marijuana to target Black people, and they criminalized LSD to target hippies. And, you know, the whole war on drugs was so that they could come in and arrest leaders of, you know, different groups, and different revolutionaries, and different enemies of the social order, as they called it. And the whole war on drugs was just a way to, arrest people and to stomp out, what they perceive to be a threat. And, can you really blame Timothy Leary for the actions of the Nixon administration? Because the Nixon administration simply was trying to stomp out what was threatening their power and control. And then what Timothy Leary was doing was allowing people to have access to these substances that basically allows people to think for themselves and experience the world with a beginner's mind and untie some of the conditionings. So, those people who blame Timothy Leary for, taking psychedelics out of the clinic, taking them out of the laboratory and releasing it into the public, I, for one, am super grateful that Timothy Leary released the substances into the masses, because if it wasn't for that, who knows how much of our culture would not even be the same. If it wasn't for Timothy Leary, there probably would not have been, as strong of a hippie movement. If it wasn't for Timothy Leary, there would not have been as strong of a anti-war movement. And there's so much of that hippie movement, of the counterculture of the 60s, that is infused into our culture today. What was the counterculture in the 60s is now our culture here in the 21st century. And that counterculture has percolated into our culture, into our mainstream culture. And if it wasn't for that, who knows how square our society would be today, So I do not share the sentiment of blaming Timothy Leary for, the mishaps of the 60s. I blame the federal government for the mishaps of the 60s.
And I agree with you. So Timothy Leary's turn on, tune in, drop out situation, this populist kind of approach that he took, definitely gave Nixon this idea, or at least this is what I believe, that this guy here is trying to take the masses and convince them that war is useless, because again, when you take psychedelics, it's not like, oh, go ahead and kill like 78 people or whatever. Psychedelics are more spiritual. They make you realize the essence of life, but also the essence of love in community, in literally every single aspect of human condition. And so, for Timothy Leary to have taken that populist approach, it isn't, as you said, how would we even know, about psychedelics if it wasn't popularized at that time? But I think what Nixon did was that he realized that, okay, now this guy is making masses go towards spirituality and no war agenda. And I right now want people to get drafted to Vietnam. And how do I do that? The way I do that is to wage war on drugs. So he started doing war on drugs, and the best mechanism I think that comes into my head was this thing about set and setting, right? So important in psychedelics. You need to have a set and a setting. You have to be comfortable, etc., etc. So they would choose purposely the horror stories where the set and settings weren't good, where people are having major psychosis kind of episodes, or as it seems like that, when you watch these videos, and then they started just like distributing this and be like, yeah, this is what LSD does to you. And so many conspiracy theories came out of it, that LSD can do this to your brain, and that psilocybin is dangerous, and DMT at that time, I'm not really sure whether it was actively talked about, although there's this brilliant very less known like not lecture but like a radio thing where Timothy Leary is talking to this guy called Roger Stevens, who is like the radio host, and you can find it on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it. It's Double Blind Timothy Leary, and you find it, and it's beautiful because it starts with his turn on, tune in, drop out kind of music, like psychedelic music, and then he gets into, oh yeah, like LSD takes you in, LSD takes you out. So it's a very beautiful radio interview, and I agree with you. I think the populist approach was perhaps one way of making people aware that these compounds actually exist, and they have all of these applications, these beautiful and these powerful applications that they have, that they're therapeutic, they're spiritual, you name it, they're heavenly, to lack for the lack of the better words. And I was watching, Terence McKenna, and how amazing Terence McKenna's lectures are. And I was watching his final interview, like 2 days ago, something like that. And because I had read Aldous Huxley, so one thing about Aldous Huxley, just to kind of, so that you understand what I mean by Terence McKenna's final interview, is that Aldous Huxley, in his book called Brave New World and the Doors of Perception, and then again his lectures at Berkeley, if you are able to access those drafts, you'll be able to see that he was, crazily enough, I would say he was 85% correct about the human condition in 21st century. And he was predicting all of this in 60s, and it's brilliant. Like, you read it and you're like, wow, like, this is I would have never thought that someone in 1960s was able to predict what's happening now. And same goes for Terence McKenna's last interview. He talks about artificial intelligence and machines and virtual reality. Like, these are such modern concepts. Like, we are still discovering the power of virtual reality, extended reality, augmented reality, etc., etc. And this guy Terence, he was able to think about it so long ago, so long ago. It's mind-boggling, I would say. And also, on top of, on the topic of Timothy Leary, his Harvard essays are pretty good, on psychedelics in general. And the prison experiments, I've kind of heard of it, but not really. I've heard some of his interviews from the prison. So there's this really good, I would say, podcast called Universal Wisdom. It's not a podcast, like they just post the lectures of Ram Dass, Alan Watts, like Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna. And I've been going through them, and I've been realizing more and more that, it's as if these thinkers, be it psychedelics, be it their intellect, were able to comprehend something that most people were not ready for. Imagine being in 60s and you're talking about virtual reality. It's insane. Like, even to conceptualize it. So it's the beauty of these thinkers that we have today. But yeah, like, what do you think about those things?
Yeah. So it's funny because I think there is a theme that kind of like unites, the 60s with, what we see contemporarily when people use psychedelics, and even what we see neuroscientifically in the brain. So I'll just preface this by saying that back when Albert Hofmann first discovered LSD, and Sandoz and like all these different people were super interested in trying to figure out, all right, what is this stuff useful for? And they did a lot of studies on animals. So they gave LSD to a bunch of different animals. And one quote that I find pretty awesome, so it's in Albert Hoffman's book LSD, My Problem Child. So there's a paragraph where he talks about giving LSD to chimpanzees, and I'll read it verbatim. It says, a caged community of chimpanzees reacts very sensitively if a member of the tribe has received LSD. Even though no changes appear in the single animal, the whole cage gets in an uproar because the LSD chimpanzee no longer observes the laws of its finely coordinated hierarchic tribal order. So that one sentence by itself, I find has a lot of deep ramifications. And just to read it again, the LSD chimpanzee no longer observes the laws of its finely coordinated hierarchic tribal order. Like, just remember the phrase finely coordinated hierarchic tribal order. So, what happened to chimpanzees that were given LSD, the whole cage was in an uproar because their finely coordinated hierarchic tribal order was upended. Similarly, what happened in the 60s? So what is the hierarchic tribal order in America? Like the president, the federal government is kind of like the top of the hierarchy. We are the top of the hierarchy, and then like the rest of society has to like follow our order, our tribal order. And what happened in the 60s was society was no longer following that finely coordinated hierarchic tribal order, and that caused an uproar. And similarly, when we look at the neuroscience of what happens when people consume psychedelics, there's been a huge focus on network dynamics in the brain. So what happens to different brain networks when people are giving psychedelics? One of the primary brain networks that gets a lot of attention when you talk about psychedelics is the default mode network. The default mode network is the best way to understand it is it's inversely correlated with the task positive network. For example, the task positive network is active when you're doing a task that requires cognitive control. For example, if you are playing chess, if you are solving a math equation, if you are, doing something that requires you to attend to it and exercise motor control and executive control. On the other hand, the default mode network is active when you are idle. So when you are doing a task, when you're engaging the task positive network, the activity in the default mode network is attenuated. So that means the default mode network is most active when you are not doing anything, when you are idle. And then one can just ponder, through introspection, what happens in your psyche when you're not doing anything. The mind has its patterns of activity. The mind has its scripts. It has its protocols. It likes to ruminate on the past. It likes to worry about the future. It likes to think about all the little humiliations that one has experienced. It likes to think about all these, just like social experiences. Like one of the most common things that the mind does when wandering is it likes to think about how a person fits in with, the social community. Does that person like me? Does this person like me? And with every person you meet, every person in your life, you have a model in their brain of how they model you. You know what I'm saying? So and this is true for every person. Like when you walk down somebody on the street, you're already creating a model of their model of you in your head. And these kind of so your mind is always keeping tabs on different ways that people see you, and this kind of like creates the experience of the ego, because the ego is this aggregate of how do people see me? How does my person, what face do I have to others? And then a lot of times when the mind does the bookkeeping or the cataloging of these memories of social esteem is, when the default mode network is active. So this is when the ego maintains itself, when you're just sitting idle, when you're daydreaming, you're mental time traveling. So a lot of researchers like Robin Carhart Harris have posited that the default mode network is the seat of the ego. And, a lot of people who suffer from different conditions such as depression or anxiety or OCD, they can be typified by an overactive default mode network or an overactive ego, or perhaps you could even call like a hyper rigid brain dynamic, such that, for example, people with depression might have an overactivity in the default mode network module responsible for rumination, thinking about all of the depressing, sad things that one has happened, sulking in self-pity, sulking in sadness and humiliation, and all these things, all these negative memories that arise from this script in the mind to dwell upon social esteem and things like that. And similarly, anxiety, people are constantly worrying about, things that are not in the present moment, or there could be acute anxiety in the present moment. But, generally with people who are smitten with anxiety, they're just worrying about things that are in the future, just worrying about things that are just like outside of the present purview. OCD, like there is this obsession to perform certain rituals, this obsession to act in a certain way, and then these impulses are like super visceral and super intense and super hard to resist, and they're marked by a rigidity in the brain dynamic. Similarly, depression there's this rigidity, and anxiety, there's a rigidity. There's not that flexibility to escape out of these protocols of the mind. And so the default mode network is it's a network of the brain that is really, really high up on the hierarchy, because when people are, contemplating themselves, contemplating, their high level conception of where they fit in their community, where they fit in the ecosystem, where they fit in, in their context, it's a pretty central network in the brain, because this network of the brain is integrating memories, it's integrating your physiological state, it's integrating your proprioception, your interoception, it's integrating a lot. It's integrating a lot of different modules of your mind. So the default mode network is really high up at the hierarchy. And what they have found in a lot of fMRI and EEG studies, when people are having mystical experiences or ego dissolution experiences, where they no longer have this feeling of being separated from the outside of the world. So like the skin is no longer a barrier, but a bridge. And there's this feeling of oceanic oneness. And then when people have these experiences, and when they report having these experiences, and they correlate it to different signals on the fMRI machine, they find that one of the most prominent signals is that there is decreased functional connectivity in the different hubs of the default mode network. So different regions of the brain that are responsible for creating this network activity, they're no longer coupled. They no longer have this finely coordinated synchronization and coupling, and different regions of the brain are kind of let off the leash. And the default mode network is responsible for regimenting a lot of the information flows. And there is kind of like a top-down information flow and a bottom-up information flow. The bottom-up information flow is just like your raw sensory data, just like raw information from the environment. And your top-down information flow is kind of like your cortical information that that regiments and sequences and basically dictates how that information is processed. So when you find that the default mode network, the finely tuned coordination of these different regions is disrupted, they're no longer able to coordinate brain activity. Different regions are let off the leash. So the top-down information flow, its ability to impose weight on how the bottom-up information flow is processed is reduced. So what would typically be filtered or regimented, from the environment is no longer being filtered and regimented. So you have disinhibition of this cognitive filter. And when you have like the top rung of the brain's hierarchy is no longer coordinating, the orchestrator is no longer orchestrating, the rest of the brain regions are let off the leash and they're able to freely mingle with other brain regions. And there's that famous diagram of the psilocybin connectivity, where it's like a circle, two circles that shows different connectivity of the brain. That's a great illustration of how when these regions of the brain are let off the leash, they're able to connect freely with other regions and form new connections. Regions of the brain that never communicate are now communicating. And, this can help with creating synesthesia. This can help with looking at things in a brand new context, a brand new light with a fresh lens that is no longer regimented or dictated by a person's prior conceptions, a person's prior conditioning. People are able to awaken into insights that are no longer stomped out or inhibited by their inner talker, their inner critic, their ego. And I just want to circle this back to the quote about the chimpanzees one more time. The LSD chimpanzee no longer observes the laws of its finely coordinated hierarchic tribal order. And then back to the United States, no longer listening to the finely coordinated hierarchic tribal order. Now let's go into the brain. The brain is no longer listening to the laws of its finely coordinated hierarchic order. So I just think that is a very beautiful congruence of kind of like the micro and the macro. What we see happening in the brain, the collapse of this hierarchical order is the same thing we see on the macro scale, this collapse of this finely coordinated hierarchical order. And that is just one of those insights that you get it and like, wow, that is awesome. And Yeah, and that's one of those things that I dwell upon frequently. And what other ways can we kind of like take this archetype of collapsing, or diminishing the influence of a finely coordinated hierarchical order, and and what domains could that apply, and what domains could this be put into consideration. And one example I'll just provide is just a revolution in general. Just revolution, just when any society or group has a revolution, like those on the lower ends of the hierarchy are no longer listening to the top of the hierarchy, and you're kind of like upending that hierarchical order. So whenever there's a revolution, that in many ways is a society having a macro psychedelic experience.
So back in 2020, the first few months before the pandemic, I contacted Dr. Rick Strassman because I was going through this phenomena called hypnagogia. And hypnagogia is this phenomena where you are in a liminal state of consciousness. So you tend to see these geometric lattice patterns. Some people report they see animal imageries. Also, there's this thing called Tetris effects, which is basically memories from your short-term memories and also from your long-term memories flashing before your eyes. So it's as if you're kind of like a third person view, and you're looking at it from that perspective. And I would get these like very often, and it wasn't only because of cannabis use, because I was like, is it because of cannabis use? Then I stopped using cannabis and it was still happening. So, I was generally very confused as to what this was. And I contacted Dr. Rick Strassman, and he told me that, a lot of people report to him about these hypnagogic experiences and say that they have DMT-like experiences, but without any DMT. So, this is where the argument comes in, where, you can take psychedelics to reach these higher dimensions, but then there's other ways, liminal state of consciousness, meditation, Kundalini yoga, etc., etc. He suggested me that I should talk to Dr. Carhart Harris. And I think he recently changed his universities. I think he was at Imperial, but now he's at UCLA, if I'm not mistaken. So that could
San Francisco.
Oh, San Francisco. So, I'm still going to, write him an email about it. What I was thinking of doing, and I have communicated this to Dr. Strassman and a bunch of other friends of mine and psychedelic podcasters, I would say, that I want to conduct a study where I take certain participants, at least 20, just to make the data larger, who have these hypnagogic experiences. And and everyone's hypnagogic experience, even though they have the same objective lattice patterns and animal imagery, there's something objective about these hallucinations, if you want to call it that. And I kind of wanted to know, if across 20, let's say we take 20 people who have hypnagogic experiences, and we put them into either an EEG machine or fMRI and see exactly what's happening in their brain when they're seeing these things. That could be, I don't think that's ever been done. I know that there's an EEG study done by Japan, in Japan, and it wasn't really that conclusive enough. Like, it didn't have much highlights onto it. And there's no fMRI yet. So the point that I was trying to get at with these hallucinations, and specifically these objective hallucinations, is that, when we go all the way back to the Greek philosophers, they would often talk about, these objective, what is the objective world, what is the subjective world, what is the distinction between both of them, and they would regard geometry, Archimedes, if I'm not mistaken, he would regard geometry as the language of the universe. So if we are these 20 people seeing the same geometric shapes, so personally the ones that I see are like star ascending in shapes, then I would see these spiders, like literally roaming around my visual field. And then I would get these Tetris effects. And the more you go into it, then you start seeing eyes, which is very, very common because in psychedelic experiences too, like you are able to see eyes and stuff like that. And you know, if these are objective across all subjective minds, then it very well could be that we do have objective symbols in the world which are penetrated into our subjective minds. That even though we have this subjectivity, even though we have our own what it is to be me and what it is to be you,
Hmm.
we still have these components which are objective. And what if these objective hallucinations, you know, as they would call it, but what if these objective symbols are actually objective symbols of the entire universe? You know,
Hmm.
so for me, you know, when I talk about psychedelics or when I think about psychedelics, it's not only lysergamines or tryptamines or any of that. It goes much more beyond that. You know, the second psychedelic renaissance that we're having, I'm very happy as to so many researches happening. And I think personally that in the next 5 to 10 years, I would be able to conduct a research like that, that would allow me to see, you know, what are the objective symbols. Um,
Yeah.
that's the beauty of
Yeah.
psychedelics, you know. It's not only contained in a box. Psychedelics is introducing you into all of these different
Mhm.
dimensions of knowledge and how much you can accumulate from them. So, you know,
Yeah.
it's a very like I always get a loss of words, but I think it's very ecstatic, it's very heavenly, it's very spiritual, and it's also very objective, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is, the funny thing, the most challenging thing about having a conversation about this topic with you is that there is so much like to talk about. Like in that one statement you just gave, like there are like 5 different things that I could just branch out and just like go into like a conversation about. So it's really hard to, talk about everything without having like a 10-hour long conversation. But I'll do my best to respond to that in a way. First of all, doing studies with hypnagogia is, I would say, a little difficult because, surfing that liminal state between wakefulness and dreaming is already challenging by itself when you're in your comfort zone. Now, imagine having somebody inside of a loud and noisy MRI machine that's going making all these clicking noises, and you're in this like bizarre medical facility. And so good luck with the hypnagogic studies with MRI machines. EEG might be easier because you're just sticking on little sticky electrodes on people's heads, but that research might be really fascinating. And there's been so much, there's a lot to talk about with the hypnagogic stuff because that liminal space between wakefulness and sleeping, I heard somebody kind of describe a protocol for getting into that space, which is, say you're like lying in bed, trying to go into sleep. And then there's kind of like that point where you just start transitioning into sleep, and then you start dreaming a little bit, but you haven't fallen asleep yet. So there's that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep. And there's all these different techniques for trying to hold on to it, because the trick is to not slip completely into sleep. Because as soon as you start, sliding into that liminal space, 2 seconds later, you're just gone. You're out. You're sleeping. So being able to tap into that liminal space and then hold it and then hold it and hold it, that's the challenging part. And one of the techniques that somebody once told me is, for example, holding a quarter in between your fingers as you are lying in bed. And as soon as you fall asleep, you lose muscle tone and you drop the quarter, right? So the idea is to like you use that quarter as kind of like a tool to be able to slowly drift into that liminal space, but like be able to like hold on to that muscle tone and not drop the quarter. And then you dropping the quarter is kind of like that like that stimulus that kind of like conditions you to be aware of that transition point. And there's all these different techniques to like home in on that. But one of the interesting ways of talking about the hypnagogic state, for example, I met you on Clubhouse. And there's another conversation on Clubhouse. I forget the name of the guy. He claims to be the former CIA operative who talks about what is it, remote viewing or something like that. And apparently one of the protocols to do remote viewing is to go into that liminal space, the hypnagogic state. And yeah, and it's really one of the really cool things about let's just call it like the dream state and the psychedelic state is, I had mentioned Robin Carhart Harris, and he has proposed a theory of consciousness and psychedelic states that it's called the entropic brain hypothesis, which basically states that the quality of a certain state of consciousness can be indexed by the amount of entropy in the consciousness. And what that means is there are, so the way Robin Carhart Harris posits it is he calls he creates a designation between what's called primary consciousness and what is called secondary consciousness. And secondary consciousness is I'll start with that one first. Secondary consciousness is like your day-to-day consciousness, like right now. It's a consciousness that is kind of like trying to minimize the amount of entropy. It's trying to create lots of order. It's trying to regiment the world and sequence it and find patterns and things of that sort, to reduce the amount of entropy and disorder and energy expenditure that the brain has to do, because the brain is a very metabolically taxing organ. I think the brain is like only 4% of body mass, but uses more than 25% of the energy. So the brain is a very metabolically taxing organ. So it has evolved all these mechanisms to minimize its energy expenditure. And the way it does that is by minimizing entropy. So we evolved these mechanisms to create order in our psyches. We evolved these mechanisms to, filter out redundant information from the environment. We evolved these mechanisms to create these boxes in which we regiment and perceive the world. And Dr. Carhart Harris calls that the secondary consciousness. And now what primary consciousness is, that's what came before secondary consciousness, such as that is like the infant consciousness. That is the consciousness before you have learned how to regiment the world, before you have learned how to cultivate an ego, before you have developed these cognitive filters that filter out the world. Different examples of primary consciousness. One of them I just mentioned is the infant state. Another one is the dream state, because in the dream state, you aren't filtering out the world. Like your neural impulses are just behaving in free flow. Similarly, the psychedelic state is an example of primary consciousness. The creative ideation state. So what unites these states is marked by their level of entropy, their level of disorder. So when the brain is no longer able to have this finely coordinated hierarchical order of operation, different regions of the brain are let off the leash, and you have what you see in the dream state, which is just this free flow of intermingling neural impulses, just coming into the theater of consciousness and aggregating into this grand image. And then similarly, the psychedelic state, you have this disinhibition of all these different regions of your brain that are activating and no longer subject to the constraints imposed by the models and conditionings and creative ideation. You're no longer bound by the rules of conventional society and different ideas and concepts, and all these different modules in the mind are able to cross-pollinate and intermingle and form novelty and new ideas. So there is this element of entropy, this element of being released from the constraints of hierarchical order that unites all of these. And you had mentioned that within the psychedelic experience, there is some sort of thread of you called it objectivity, and perhaps I'll frame it insofar as that there's definitely archetypes. We see archetypes that are common amidst different people, amidst different species, amidst different things that exist, and I think that what gives us these archetypes is the fact that we are all cut from the same cloth. We all emerge from the same ground of existence. We are comprised of the same matter, the universe. We all stem from the same universe. We all stem from the same earth. Well, perhaps if we're talking extraterrestrials, perhaps not the same Earth, but we all stem from the same universe. And within that universe, matter behaves the way that matter behaves in that universe. And, that it creates, all these patterns and archetypes that are common to matter. And, on that note, I think one of the greatest things that, for example, intelligent people, if you look at intelligent people that are really, really intelligent, and you try and figure out, all right, what's something that all the intelligent people that I know have in common? The most intelligent, I think everybody's intelligent, but the most intelligent people, what is something they all have in common? What is something that makes someone a genius? What is something that makes someone super intelligent? And I think that one thing that unites the most intelligent people that I know is their ability to have cross-domain thinking. What that means is they're able to see patterns in one domain and then apply it in another domain. For example, somebody might see how a leaf of one plant attaches itself to a larger tree to grow up above the canopy and get sunlight, and then use that insight to come up with an analogy for how to succeed in business. You know what I'm saying? So they're able to find patterns in one domain and then apply it in other domains. And this is something that Douglas Hofstadter would probably call an isomorphism. So, when you're able to, perceive a concept and then within that concept derive an abstract structure or an image schema, and then be able to apply that abstract structure or image schema and map it onto another domain and then find patterns. And you find that, the way a certain concept in one modality has an abstract structure, and then something in another modality also has an abstract structure, and you kind of map them onto each other and then find ways that patterns emerge. This is what that commonality of the abstract structure or the image schema, Douglas Hofstadter would call a symbol. And then he would also call it an isomorphism. So an isomorphism is a concept in mathematics. So if you derive an abstract structure or an image schema, for example, an example of an image schema is if you think of the term containment. And then the term containment, you can conjure up an image schema of some entity, so like surrounded, amidst the border, and something is contained. You know what I'm saying? And then this notion of containment, you can kind of like apply to different contexts. So there's this notion of being able to abstract the environment, pull out, the patterns, and then find isomorphisms with cross-domain. And this also might be what contributes to synesthesia. Synesthesia, in some ways, you are mapping on one modality onto another modality. So there is the sort of like conceptual synesthesia that happens in the most creative and intelligent minds, where the ability is to derive out patterns and apply them in different modalities. And there's also this notion of when people are in deep psychedelic states, there is a reduction in top-down constraints. So for example, some patterns might be kind of obvious if you really just think about them, but people aren't able to see them because they're so caught up in perhaps a functional fixedness. They only see one domain in that domain, and they see another domain in another domain. But perhaps in the psychedelic state, the compartmentalization of different domains is no longer compartmentalized. They occupy the same field, and this allows the mind to kind of like create those patterns, and by creating those patterns, it's able to extract out the commonalities, the motifs, the archetypes, the patterns, and this leads me to think of this in many ways what might be a paradox, because as conscious beings, we evolved from more simple consciousnesses, and our brains sort of underwent a process of encephalization. Some of the less conscious modalities of nervous tissue were able to encephalize into the cortex, where our cortexes are able to process more information and integrate different modules of thought. So there's sort of a way, there's sort of a process of, if we start talking, integrated information theory of consciousness, it stipulates that what you can measure the quality of consciousness with phi, the letter phi in Greek, and what that measures is the integrated information in the brain. So you have all these different channels of information, all these different modules, all these different information flows that are kind of being integrated and creating like a macro picture. So one element of intelligence is being able to aggregate more information and integrate more information. So you increase the amount of information. And then, but then the other component of intelligence is taking that information, that complexity, and being able to make it simple, being able to derive the patterns, being able to derive the archetypes, being able to kind of compress, what might be a level of information that is overwhelming and excessive and a sensory overload in a way, and then being able to parse out the patterns, to parse out the motifs, to parse out the archetypes. So that's kind of like the paradox right there. Intelligence is being able to behold lots of information with minimal effort by reducing it into the most basic archetypes. And in that psychedelic state of that oceanic field, there is this ability to aggregate, like all of the information of one's existence. For example, in regular consciousness, if you were to process all of the information in your brain at one time, that would be a complete clusterfuck. It would be a complete sensory overload, but when you're able to kind of perceive like the entire aggregate of information in your mind, in the universe, within these archetypes, that kind of like takes away the load. And this is where like some really deep patterns and motifs and archetypes might even come into play. For example, the Ouroboros. For example, the yin and yang. There's all these kind of like fundamental archetypes that are, able to be perceived or conceived of in these higher states of consciousness. And they speak to some really deep fundamentalities of the universe. I would think that that a yin and yang is a really deep and fundamental truth of the universe. That you had talked about objectivity. I think the yin and yang is, one of the most evident truths about the universe. The polarity and the unity within the polarity is a really deep truth. It's really deep archetype. Another one is the Ouroboros. This this circular, recursive, life begets death, death begets life. Sort of. There's so much to extract out of the Ouroboros archetype, but I think this is kind of like what great scholars like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung were alluding to when we look at great myths and the what Campbell would call the hero's journey. And the hero's journey in many ways represents a you could even call it like a death and a rebirth. And that's the Ouroboros right there, a death and a rebirth. And even the psychedelic experience. Timothy Leary wrote his book, The Psychedelic Experience, inspired by the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead is all about, the process of reincarnation, of dying, of the process of being guided through death, guided through the bardo, which is the liminal space between death and life, and then being reborn. And similarly, the psychedelic experience is, this collapse of the order. For example, I had mentioned that when people have these ego dissolution experiences, it's because that top of the hierarchy is no longer in control. And then there is this sort of like a surrender of the rest of, the order of the organism. And then after, the psychedelic experience goes away, there's sort of like a rebirth, a reintegration back into that ordered state. So the psychedelic experience is that descent into the entropic chaos, and then this rebirth into a more sound order.
You touched on a lot of good topics. So I like my intelligence model, um, like the prime aspect of it is creativity. And when I talk about creativity as a subset of intelligence, then creativity subset is cross-domain intellectual thinking. And so just to put that into an exercise right now, when you were talking about, archetypes, so when we look at the analytical psychology background, which is where Carl Jung comes in, it's very interesting to see that his formulation of collective unconscious and the way he terms collective unconscious is that it is not individual, it is collective, it is shared. Um, and so, like you, me, everyone on this planet collectively shares this unconscious aspect. And these unconscious aspects are sometimes, or most of the times, rooted in the culture and the history. And that's where the symbolicism comes in, and stuff like that. So, when we are hallucinating, specifically on DMT, and we see these entities, or people report that they have seen entities, these Aztec entities, Mayan entities, Egyptian entities, Hindu deities. Like, it makes me really, really wonder, as to, first of all, how are we able to see these things? Does it have a higher purpose? Does that mean something for religion in itself? Because again, these are deities. These are, not just some figure. These are actual deities that we know in history have existed, and we know in history have been, they have been preyed upon. And these entities are archetypes, right? Like, you can have the archetype of Holy Mother. So you can take Mary as that. Because what are archetypes? Archetypes are universally recognizable patterns, right? So, you can have any archetype. And now when you're taking any classic psychedelic, I would say, in moderate to higher doses, you're able to bring these archetypes come alive from your collective unconscious. So it's as if, so Jung had two things. There was personal unconscious, and then there was collective unconscious. Personal unconscious is completely unique to you, completely subjective. But collective unconscious is this shared one. And so when we're like, this is what I think, or that when we are going through psychedelic experiences, and we tend to see entities or symbols, and just geometry, let's say, specifically if it's a lysergamine, you tend to see these archetypes that Jung talked about come alive. So what are these archetypes? You can question, yeah, this archetype means this, but why are we seeing these archetypes? That's the metaphysical twist to these kind of questions. And then also, going to what I would call semantic psychoanalysis is where this French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan comes in. You were mentioning primary consciousness in an infant, right? So in my head, I was like, yeah, so Lacan talked about this mirror stage. This mirror stage is when, let's suppose I'm a kid and there's a mirror in front of me. I see myself for the very first time. That is the moment I realize that there is something like me, that there's a self. And then later on you understand ego and everything else, but that is the first realization of of this identity that I have, of who am I. There's this one of the old Indian sages tend to said that it's called nan yar, who am I? That's the question that we're always asking, who am I? And this who am I thing comes into fruition as soon as this infant looks at this mirror. So, again, cross domain thinking. But it's extremely interesting to me how these archetypes come alive, and that these archetypes have some sort of an intrinsic meaning as to what these archetypes are. But there has to be a collision between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, as to, yes, we did see the collective archetypes, the shared ones, but it does have to have a personal inclination. There's like I'm a subjective person, you know, even if I'm seeing something objective, that objective does have some sort of an effect on my subjectivity. It goes hand in hand. So those are just certain things that keeps my mind occupied most of the time, you know, especially when it comes to psychedelics, and
Mhm.
you know, how much we can just like, again, cross domain thinking.
Mhm.
How much can we
Yeah.
express that?
Yeah, and it's so funny because yeah, just like last time, like there's so many like little topics that we could just go dive so deep in on, and it's just like so difficult because I like the curious intellectual in me wants to talk about it all, but I know we are limited on time. Um, but I will say, um, I think part of the reason why we have like these fundamental archetypes is simply just by virtue of the fact that we are beings of matter and energy, and our nervous systems learn what it's like to to be a being of matter and energy. For example, one archetype is we spend our whole lives uh you know, like in a world where things that are solid, things don't go through them. For example, you know, we understand that if you put your finger up on, if you punch a wall, your hand's not going to go through, and if you drop a ball, it's going to fall to the ground. If you have water flowing on the ground, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna meander, it's gonna do its thing. And I think part of being a a being with a nervous system is the nervous system is tasked with um understanding its environment and understanding uh its context, where it's situated, and you know, and it derives these kind of like intuitive, instinctual um understandings of, all right, how does matter move, how does matter work, how does this all work, and then by being in this substrate, we reflexively intuit that this substrate has these patterns built into it. This substrate has these mechanisms and motifs and archetypes built into it, and it's just a matter of, it's just a product of being amidst this substrate of matter and energy. And that's one of the really cool things about Taoism as a philosophy, because Taoism loves to focus on, you know, what is the order of natural things? What is the flow of the cosmos? The cosmos is this flowing, growing organism. And you try and find ways to be in harmony with that growing, flowing organism. And they use a lot of analogies of water. You know, you follow the water course way, you learn how to be water. Bruce Lee got famous for his whole be water quote in his little speech about being water, and that's Taoism. And you know, to be in flow with the Tao, you learn how to understand how water flows, and that's how you flow, that's how your own emotions flow. Our own neurological mechanisms operate the same way that all physical mechanisms work. You know, our emotional states, you know, operate under the same principles of flow and tension and you know, pressure building up and releasing. The enjoyment of music, classical music, for example. Benjamin Zander has a really great TED talk where he you know, tries to illustrate why we find certain classical music really pleasant. And you know, it starts with like that note, for example, like a C note, and then you know, it takes you along this journey, like and then it makes you think it's going to resolve, but then it tricks you, it goes back up, and then finally when it resolves, like it takes you back to that same note that it started, the home note, like dun dun dun, and you know what I'm saying. And so the whole idea is like, it starts you with that home note, and then it raises all this tension, and then raises all this tension, makes you think it's going to resolve, raises all this tension, and then finally catharsis, releases the tension. A similar thing with orgasm. You know, with sexual stimulation, there is this buildup of tension, buildup of tension, buildup of tension, and then finally a release of that tension. So there's kind of like a consonance between the enjoyment of music and the enjoyment of sex. And there's all of these patterns and motifs and archetypes. That's just a matter of being made out of matter. And there was another thing you mentioned. So you talked about entities. So the DMT entities, that conversation right there opens a whole can of worms, because there is a lot of speculation about the nature of the entities that people report seeing on DMT. One of the camps says, oh, they're just archetypes. They're just projections of your psyche. They're just, you're conjuring up a personification of different archetypes that are innate. And you are like the entities you see are your own projection. Another camp says that the entities you see on DMT are not just projections of your own psyche. They're actually out there. They're actually intelligent entities that are mysterious. And then somehow when you are on DMT, there is a communication that is fomented. Perhaps you become a beacon, and then this beacon draws in the entities, and then what these entities are. If to have this conversation, you have to start it with suspension of disbelief. You just have to enter the conversation with the openness that we're going to talk about things that might be ontologically dubious, but just for the sake of intellectual curiosity, we're going to talk about it anyway. So yeah, what if these entities are like these actual intelligent entities that are out there, and then and are able to communicate with people under the influence of DMT? That begs the question, all right, then, what are they? Are they from another star system? Are they humans in the future who have evolved to a point where they have transcended our carnal limitations and exist in this ethereal plane of of energy that's timeless? Or are they just like gods? For example, like in the Buddhist cosmology, are they just like the gods that just like live in parallel with us? Are they spirits of the earth? Are they spirits of another planet? You know what I'm saying? So there's all this mystery behind the DMT entities. And Terence McKenna, I think his ultimate conclusion was he believed that they were spirits. He believed that the entities, that's what you become when you die, and that's what enters the organism for birth. And then they're in the Bardo state. They live in the Bardo, and so there's all these different interpretations and beliefs about these entities, and I welcome all of that discourse, because one of the most boring ways to live is to think that we've figured it all out. I think mystery infuses life with so much richness, and to not know the answers, I think, is a very, very interesting place to be. And it's just awesome. And I think there are so many people that are that fear the mystery. So many people are that they just spurn the mystery, or even mentioning the possibility that like, what if they are actually out there? What if they're aliens? What if they're spirits? What if they're angels? What if they're gods? Like, just even entertaining that conversation kind of like it goes out of the scientific materialist reductionism. And that's why the field of psychedelics is a really interesting one, especially seeing its marriage with science and the Renaissance in science. Because if we're going to be like really true about studying these substances, we have to be able to study them with the full gamut of the experience. Who knows if science will ever be able to find a way to study the entities and figure out who or what they are. But I think the DMT entities they're super, super interesting, and it's a mystery that I love. That I love that the mystery is there.
So have you heard of the book of I Ching?
I have heard of the I Ching, yes, the I Ching.
Do you think there's something there that could maybe give us more insight into these archetypes of some sort?
I don't know enough about it to make an opinion on that. I know of the book's existence. I've actually never engaged with it or read about it. But what's your take on it?
I think it does a good job at explaining so I Ching is this a book of divination, essentially, and it has all sorts of hexagonal like it's not archetypes, but it's like structures. And for some reason, just like looking at those structures, people tend to say that they have gone towards different kinds of consciousness. They have transcended, something like that. But what's even more interesting than I Ching is that there's this book called Kabbalion, the Kabbalion, and it was written by three initiates. It's a book by Hermes Trismegistus, and it talks about 6 universal principles. The principle of polarity, the principle of rhythm, vibration, etc., etc. And there's this principle of polarity, right? And polarity again somehow connects to the archetype of yin and yang. If you were to creatively kind of explore it in your head. So this aspect of I Ching divination, which Terence McKenna really talks about in a lot of his lectures, and then these other archetypes that people tend to see either within their lysergamine experiences, tryptamine, which are same again objective. It makes me wonder that if hopefully after the legalization aspect and those kind of researches are done, and we're finally able to do researches of our own interest and see exactly what these archetypes are, why these archetypes are coming from collective unconscious, and was Jung right? That is the biggest question. Was Jung right? And I think he was. I think he was to a very great extent. He talked about mescaline in one of his letters, but he was quite critical about it. So people don't necessarily know whether that criticism was valid, in the sense that people actually think that. So yeah, Carl Jung, analytical psychology, archetypes, collective unconscious, personal unconscious, all of these things. People back in the day when Carl Jung was actually practicing as a psychiatrist, as a psychologist, a lot of people would laugh at him, and specifically Freud, because Freud had this ambition that, hey, I've founded the unconscious. I'm trying to create psychotherapy, and it cannot be, and it has to be scientific to a certain level. So I cannot deal with your archetypes and entities and all of that stuff. But years, like now, 2022, we see these archetypes coming in psychedelic experiences. So it makes me wonder if he actually was alive even after 60s. He could have maybe seen his actual psychology coming to life, and Freud being defeated there. I'm like, I'm kind of a Jungian, so I gotta say that. But what do you think, like this? So cognitive science is not only psychology, and computer science and neuroscience. So it's like a multidisciplinary field. Do you think this multidisciplinary field would be able to unlock most of the mysteries of psychedelics that are yet to be even thought of, like that are so bizarre that we even cannot think about it?
Yeah. I think for that to happen, there has to be an introduction of a new paradigm, because the way the current paradigm works, it's very based on scientific materialism, reductionism, and that sort of way of engaging epistemologically has its use. It has its purpose in systemizing the world. It has its purpose of observing, recording, and deriving, certain patterns, that are empirical and replicatable and falsifiable. And it's great at what it does. It's great at helping with engineering. It's great at understanding the history of the geology of the earth. It's good at understanding, astrology and the stars, and there are so many great uses for that apparatus of science. And science is a method. Science is a method of inquiry, and the way that method works, it's good at what it does for what it does. But for what you're talking about, the paradigm would have to include more than just the scientific paradigm. The paradigm would have to include modalities such as the poetic modality. It would have to include different modalities of engaging and deriving truths, and being able to look at the psyche and find the patterns, to look at the psyche and find the archetypes, and to be able to engage with archetypes in an intellectual sandbox without having to have a really rigid contingency upon like all the parameters of scientific discourse, while still maintaining this desire for truth and objectivity. But that being said, it definitely requires a new paradigm. And if I will just elaborate a little bit more on what I mentioned earlier about how we are all cut from the same cloth, and we experience all these archetypes as a collective unconscious, because we come from the same source. We are cut from the same cloth. We are all organisms of matter. And despite our many differences as individuals, despite the uniqueness of all of our our fingerprints, our neural prints too. Despite all of the diversities that we have, we are way more alike than we are different. And just to illustrate that, look at how much alike we are to, let me just pick out a random animal. A prairie dog. Look at a prairie dog. Prairie dog has 2 eyes, has 2 nostrils, has a mouth, has fingers, has the same exact bone structure, 2 bones here, 1 bone here, same number of wrist bones. You look at a fish. Look at the similarities we have with a fish. We're both vertebrates. We both have that same bilateral symmetry. We both have 2 eyes and a mouth, and most of them have 2 little nostrils, and you know what I'm saying. So when you look at just look at how similar we are to a fish, and then go all the way down the evolutionary tree to humans. Like, our physiology, of course, there is variation in our physiology among humans, but we are way more similar than we are different. And that similarity endows us with, the same substrate. Our brains, yes, there might be, neurodivergent people who have, idiosyncrasies in how their brains are structured, but for the most part, our brains all work the same way. Neurons signal the same way. We are made of the same substrate, and we are, and these substrates are plugged into the same ground of existence, the same environment, the same context. So that being said, the way we engage, the things we intuit from the universe are common amongst all of us. And that's where these archetypes come from, because these archetypes are just reflections on what it's like to be a being of matter and energy, and to be a being of matter and energy that turns inward and looks upon itself, which that is, the strange loop of Douglas Hofstadter. You could even call that a version of the Ouroboros archetype. Matter that turns inward and looks upon itself, and it learns of itself, and it builds these models and conceptions of itself. And that's where these archetypes come from. And that's why we have these archetypes that are so common, because we all commonly derive from the same substrate, from the same context. And then these interactions between these organisms that sprout from the universe and then try to navigate their way around this little ecosystem of the universe, there's going to be the same patterns, the same challenges, the same environments, the same context. And these archetypes are just patterns of matter and energy. And to try and parse that into a way that is epistemologically compatible with our current catalogs of thought and knowledge, it just takes really good articulation. And that's the problem. A lot of this stuff is really difficult to articulate. For example, to behold an archetype is in many cases is a very visual experience, or at least that's how I experience archetypes. I close my eyes and I see the billowing universe, and it's folding in on itself, and all these imageries are so ineffable, so difficult to put into words, but the image is there. There's an image that is extremely hard to put into any articulate manner and still having any meaning. And there is, the other aspect of when you talk about these things, there is the side that a lot of it is just has a noetic quality that you had mentioned, and that noetic quality is like, I'm beholding something that is true, and I know that it's true because it is just so obvious that it's true. It is just like it's something that is just like beheld at the very deepest of the core, that like, okay, this is as true as truth gets. But how are you going to convince a square who's never seen anything of the sort that the nonsense that you're speaking is cosmic truth? You know what I'm saying? There is an element of, in order to understand, you have to have experienced it. And you know, experience is itself empirical, because you know that's the definition of empirical, is something that's observed. So there is a way to reconcile the fact that things that are scientific have to be empirically based, and experiences are empirical. And of course, you know, then the other counter argument is, you know, your experiences are subjective. But I like to say that there is a paradox such that our subjective experience is based in something that's objective. One of them, for example, you know, there's a conversation about color. The colors that we experience subjectively, are they derived from a universal objective color palette that all organisms see the same? And then you throw in all these confounding variables that kind of confuse the whole question. You know, what about the organisms that can see infrared and ultraviolet? Do their color palettes have another dimension of quality that we just cannot fathom? Do they see additional colors, or do they see the same color palette that we see? It's just like the gradations are shifted a little bit, you know. And that those are some really interesting questions, and I don't know if we have the capability to answer them. But you know, one could, just for the sake of argument, just posit the assumption that sure, what we see as color might be an objective palette that we all tap into, and then color is some deeply innate quality of the universe that has an objective side, but we parse it subjectively. And then you could similarly talk about so many different archetypes and experiences as being an objective quality of the universe that we experience through our own subjective lenses. And that's kind of like where you behold the paradox, where within subjectivity is objectivity.
That's a good one. So tell me, okay, so I have this thing where I was constructing this thing. It's an effect, which is that there's two variables, A and B, and by the virtue of them interacting with each other, we get to learn more about them independently. So, you know, this is something that we've been exercising with consciousness and AI, right? Like we're trying to understand what consciousness is by making AI, and then, you know, trying to see whether, okay, can we create, you know, synthetic consciousness? Like, you know, and in that way, you know, we're using two different variables to try to understand what this one thing is. And maybe we can do that with psychedelics as well. You know, I haven't really thought about it, but within the area of cognitive science, all of these different fields that come in, maybe we can analyze psychedelics from each and every field, and then try to like not cross domain thinking, but like see where they connect together, see if there's a point where all of them are congruent, and whether that means something, because that would entail a lot about not only just psychedelics but also consciousness, right? Like consciousness is the biggest mystery that we have. What is qualia, what is consciousness, blah blah blah. But are we ever going, of course, like there's a lot of speculation that we're never going to understand what consciousness is, but we can always get closer, right? And so this quest of getting closer is what drives human mind and curiosity towards, you know, trying to understand psychedelics from, you know, neuroscientific perspective, but then also analytical psychology and philosophy and everything. So what do you think about this kind of effect actually coming into play?
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity for there to be cross-pollination. And, you know, it's so funny because this gets really full circle and recursive in a way, because what you just described is having different domains that are typically compartmentalized, no longer being compartmentalized and being able to integrate with each other. And that itself is a reflection of the psychedelic experience itself, with all these different regions of the brain that are typically compartmentalized, no longer being compartmentalized and being able to integrate and form a holistic picture. Similarly, we have all these different systems of epistemology that we can that are typically compartmentalized. And, you know, what if we find a way to no longer have them be compartmentalized, and we're able to integrate all these different insights from all these different modules and modalities, and build a holistic, bigger picture out of that. And yeah, I think that's a very beautiful thing that we can do.
No, I would love to exercise this with you if you're ever free. This is something that needs investigation. But thank you so much, Ramzy, for coming on. Like, I need to rewatch this and I need to get my brain, like just firing all my neurotransmitters, trying to understand what this podcast was all about. But no, really, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you. As a human being, as a person who was on Clubhouse, the first time we met, the Terrence McKenna groups, everything. And I'm absolutely, like, I really appreciate the work that you're doing in Boulder with the decriminalization. I really hope that you succeed in that, and I think you would. I really think you would. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to having more conversations.
Yeah, me too. Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.